coming up next, we have a panel called Why Working with a Publisher from Day One is Becoming the New Normal for Hypercasual Developers. And we should have Falko from JoyPac joining.
Hey, how are you?
Hey, Falko, you're ready to come in straight away there.
Ready to go.
Brilliant. So if you're all good, I will let you crack on.
Awesome. Yeah. Let's get this going. Let me quickly share my screen here.
No worries.
All right.
All right. Looks good to me. Have fun. I'll speak to you soon.
All right. Thanks. Yeah, I hope there's not too much overlap with the previous talk from Miniclip. I just caught the end of it after preparing for this. This is aimed mostly at developers that are interested in getting into hypercasual, who are just getting into hypercasual, or maybe developers that have been working with the same publisher for a long time and kind of want to explore the options that are out there. For hypercasual, the business models are kind of unique, have been from the beginning. And now this year, we've seen a big change in the way that a lot of publishers start cooperating with the developers. So if you're already experienced and work with like a bunch of different publishers over the last year, you probably know a lot about this. But if you're new to this, I hope there's some valuable information about for you. Quickly about me, my name is Falko. I've been in the games industry for a little bit over 13 years, and always in free-to-play games on PC, and the last couple of years mobile. At JoyPac, I'm the publishing manager, so I'm the first contact that developers have, usually with the company from the introduction, but then I also take developers through the whole process, kind of talk to you on a day-by-day basis, trying to figure out all the little problems and challenges that come with publishing hyper-casual games, specifically in this super quick market that we have in hyper-casual. I want to quickly talk about the publishing models that we had in hypercasual for quite a while to kind of give a bit of background to what we're moving to recently. The biggest, most common model that I saw was the licensing model, where mostly developers finished an MVP version of the game, kind of like an advanced, somewhere between a prototype and a finished game, by themselves on their own time, on their own money, and then reached out to a publisher of their choice, and that publisher then ran a market test with that game, doing a little bit of user acquisition to get some people into the game and see some early metrics, specifically focusing on marketing data, but also looking at retention and playtime and these kind of things. And then every publisher had their own unique kind of benchmark to hit, and if the game hit it, then they offered the developer a contract for a full publishing. Usually that was very easy, kind of like a very quick setup to get your game tested by a publisher. So a lot of developers kind of moved from, started with the biggest publisher, and then if they didn't hit their benchmark just yet, they went kind of down the stack of publishers, because different publishers had different kind of goals for their KPIs. The other model that was maybe not quite as frequent was the work for hire model, where publishers had a very specific idea of how they want the game to look like, the gameplay, the setting, the production values, and then reached out to developers more of a contractor style basis, where they dictated exactly what game to develop, and then paid the developer the development cost plus some contractor margin that would usually go on top of that. But these two models had some problems for different kind of publishers. Let's say for JoyPac, we were mostly known for being a publisher that is very active in China, had a pretty good reputation there, so it was not so much of a problem for us getting content for that. But then when we moved more to global publishing in the second half of last year, it was hard for us to get like really good content, because as I said, as a developer, you usually go to the most established publisher in the market, which we weren't for the West at that point, definitely. So generally, these publishers kind of skimmed the best games, of course, off the top. So if you hit the benchmarks of a top publisher, you would probably stick with that publisher and then make your way down the stack. So we were the third or fourth publisher in most of the cases to see that game. So it was very hard to find a game that really had cutting edge numbers so we could push it to the top of the charts. Of course, there's some differences where some publishers are better for some games than others, but yeah, the probability of finding a game that's right for you just goes down with not being that established. Also, the publishers that have been working with studios for a longer time kind of had those studios move to other publishers after a while. Branching out, trying to see what kind of deals they could get with other people. These deals were usually on a game-by-game basis. So sometimes studios just use the first kind of games to establish a portfolio and show that they have good games that are that can top the market. And then after starting maybe with smaller publishers, they've been moving on to other publishers as well. And then the work for hire studios sometimes stop doing that because they want to maybe self-publish. That goes for other developers as well. They kind of build a little bit of a bank to invest into user acquisition, or they kind of get the experience to get all that stuff going. So it was hard for publishers to establish a reliable content pipeline with new games coming out in a regular way, unless you got tons and tons of games sent to you. So that was one of the problems we faced that we wanted to address. So this new model, and for JoyPac, we call this Hyperfuel, kind of like an online accelerator. But there are different versions of this in a bunch of different publishers these days. And I'll point out some things that I think are very unique for us. But something that we've been seeing more and more, we started talking about it end of last year and started testing it with some of the studios that we already had a good relationship with earlier this year. So since early this year, we've been working with a few studios on this model and are now rolling it out to a bit of a wider developer audience. Is kind of in between model, but it's more set up for an ongoing basis. So one of the differences, the publisher covers the development cost of new games in this scenario, but they don't cover it in the work for hire way, where there's like a big margin for the for studios to live off of that. But it's more the at cost basis. There's a higher share that comes out of that compared to work for hire. So there are some upsides for the developer later, but they don't have to deal with like the base cost that it takes them to produce like new games or prototypes. Also, the publisher will provide a lot of market data and portfolio insights. So of course, as a publisher, we launched over 45 games. So we have data on a bunch of different games, and we tested more than double that. So we can give this information or make it available to the developer and kind of use this to evaluate kind of like new ideas and new games very early on. Also, there are like market tools that are pretty expensive and maybe not accessible to smaller studios. And through their publisher, they can get access to a lot of knowledge that comes out of these market research tools. For Hyperfuel specifically, our model, the developer always stays in creative control of the projects. So while we might suggest settings, themes, gameplay trends that we are seeing, and point out like advantages of disadvantages that we saw with these different models or subgenres over time, the creative control for the games that we want to work on with the developer always stays within the team. And we're not going to tell anybody what we know better until we actually test something in the market. So we're always open to test new ideas through the system as well. And then, as I mentioned, this is set up for an ongoing partnership. So we usually start with a minimum of 3 months that we provide funding to the developer. Generally, we aim at 2 prototypes or a little bit more smaller test versions. I'll come back to that later in these kind of scenarios. So it's also a little bit of a safer model. So you're covered for a certain amount of time, and the chance of finding something that works, because you have to try a lot of different games in Hypercasual to find something that really hits and sticks, is much higher if you have these ongoing relationships. And then of course it's easier to transfer something into something where you keep making games together after that, kind of providing a steady partner and security for the developer, but also for the publisher, kind of offering a pipeline of new titles coming in exclusively to them on a regular basis. So of course, working together that early brings a couple of extra advantages over risk management and these kind of things. And as I mentioned, those can be insights into the current market situation from day one. So it's not like you make your game, go out to different publishers, and then get the feedback that, oh, that's not really what the market is looking for right now. But you get that during the concept stage of your game. So from the beginning, you can kind of like decide on what's hot, what do I think is cool, but maybe was tried, or get confirmation that my idea is really unique and could be really strong super early. And the publisher will give that feedback directly on concepts. So rather than waiting for the developer to finish a prototype and then talk about that, we generally sit down and talk about a bunch of different concepts, 5 to 6, 7, 8 concepts that the developer prepares. And then we sit down together and kind of figure out what we think will be strong, what has a good timing right now, or maybe combining them. Like the setting of this one sounds really cool, but I think the gameplay from this one could be really strong, and then remixing and combining that. So you have that like super early on before you spend any major amount of development time and cost on a prototype. And you can test much earlier. I have some numbers at the end because I wanted to provide a little bit more value than just describing a business deal at the end of the presentation about how these tests kind of run and what you can get out of really early testing, what we call CTR tests, where you test an ultra early version of the game. But let's start with the deal terms first. So again, going back to comparing them to the deals that were established in the market before, these licensing kind of deals where the developers had to fund most of the game by themselves before getting into contact with the publishers, we generally saw pretty favorable terms for the developers after that. I mean, they were carrying pretty much all the risk during development. So generally, you see a 50 profit share. That means that's the revenue minus whatever Apple or Google takes, and minus anything that was directly invested into marketing and paid out to ad networks, for example. No internal cost or something like that, but anything that kind of is paid to other companies up front. The IP always stays with the developers, or in most cases stay with the developers in these scenarios. So if you want to make a follow-up for a game, that was always in your rights to do that by yourself. And then there are some further guarantees that you could get, like a minimum amount of UA spend from the publisher, or some security measures, like a minimum amount of daily active users is something we did a lot to kind of guarantee that, hey, we're going to really work on your game, not just leave it hanging there. So, and kind of guarantees that if we don't hit a number of minimum users that are in your game every day, you have the right to take the game back and maybe self-publish or work with another publisher. On the work for hire end, the publishers were taking on most of the risk, if not all of the risk of the development. And the developer was kind of expected to make a little bit of money on the development itself. So on top of the internal cost, there was kind of a margin that should keep it, like carry the developer to the next project. But in return, work for hire usually has terrible profit shares, right? So under 10% is very common. Sometimes you see 5% and lower. So you really kind of have to make the money on the development of the game yourself. It's a little bit less risky if the game flops, but then if you have a hit, the upside for a developer is also not that big. And of course, the publisher owns everything that you made for that game in that case. So there might be like a bonus for you if the game hits a certain amount of download numbers that you can negotiate, but the IP and everything stays with your publisher. I mentioned that the new model is kind of like in between the two, and that also goes for the deal terms. So in most cases, the publisher will cover the majority of the full cost, internal cost that you have for developing these new prototypes or CTR test versions or whatever you agree on. And a final product will generally have somewhere between 30 to 40% profit share. So way higher than what a traditional work for hire scenario would provide. A little bit lower than a model where the developer has all the risk up front, but usually not as much as you might think. So it's still, there's still a huge upside for a developer to have a successful game in the market that comes out of this idea. And as I said, it's a little bit more reliable because you're covered for development usually on an ongoing basis for a while. The IP also stays with the developer. In our case, we have it structured in a way where the rights to all the prototypes developed that we don't end up publishing stay with the developer. So if we had a prototype tested pretty decently, not really up to what we need within JoyPac, but you think you could still operate that fairly profitable by yourself, then you can go back and use that prototype later and publish it yourself, try with a different publisher. It's yours to keep and decide on what to do. And the IPs, even for the published games, all those rights will remain with the developer, of course. And then just as with the other deals, there might be some other incentives for developers that come after that. So how do these tests work? Like, what are you testing actually? I want to talk a little bit about that. First of all, almost every publisher you work with will use Facebook as their main platform. And I know that there's some stuff changing with iOS, but for Hypercasual, we expect that to remain the same, because in Hypercasual, you often try to test as widely as possible, every age group, every gender. That's why you see a lot of game concepts that kind of try to capture as many, to be as wide as possible, from like very everyday situations that everybody can almost equally relate to. There are some subgenres or territories that require some specialization, and then you see other partners coming up. So for us, we publish a lot in China, where Facebook is not an option. We work with Mintegrill there, for example, which has been very reliable for us. But then also sometimes you have games that are a bit more niche, where you expect higher retention, but maybe some more challenging marketing. And then we would also work with Mintegrill or Unity Ads, AppLovin, you name it. The most important part is that in your tests, the consistency is key. So you should always launch on the same day, not have a weekend in one test, but not in another. Don't test over the holidays or something like that. You will, even if you test the same game, probably experience some fluctuation based on when you do it. There's a timing element to it, but you should do everything you can that is within your control to keep it as consistent as possible. So for the results, the target KPIs, as I mentioned, will definitely vary a lot by the publisher that you're working with. So in general, the bigger the publisher, the higher standards they will have for the retention numbers, for the cost per installs, and so on. If you do these CTR tests, and those are really kind of like, often there's not even a playable build. So you have a Unity scene where you kind of simulate the gameplay and then have a quick video, and then you link, I don't know, to the App Store, to the rest of your portfolio. But what you're really interested in is how many people click on that, how much base interest is there in something like this. For those tests, you generally see a hard target. So if it's under 4% of people clicking on the ad, the game is out. The game is out, and everything above you kind of like look into further. And then once the versions advance, you can see more holistic looks at the business model. So for every test that you run throughout the development of the game, you will have more data to look at: the conversion rate, cost per installs, once you have an app in the store, retention in-game data, day 1 retention, day 3, the playtime per player per day, and these kind of things. And then later on, once the game goes live, day 7 retention and beyond. So then you care more about the combination of these things. So a little bit higher marketing cost is okay if the people stay in your game for a long while, for example. So you see that's shifting a little bit. I have some numbers here those are also changing, and it changes a little bit between the different kind of business and corporation models that we see. Feel free to take a screenshot of this and look at this later. As I said, they differ between publishers, but it's a good kind of like baseline if you're testing by yourself, if you just want to see, or if you want to set some expectations of what to achieve with your games in early test. These are some of the numbers you should be looking out for. And if that is something that is interesting to you, if you have a game that you want to get published, or the model of this kind of cooperation that I explained is interesting to you, we are of course always open and looking for new studios to work with on that. We have been publishing games for over 2 years now, 3 almost, and have been done that very successfully in China, and for about a year now also in the West, had a couple of chart-topping hits also in the US. So yeah, we're looking for new studios to partner with, for new games to push to the top of the charts. And yeah, I guess if you have any questions about this, we have some time now, but also reach out to me via email, LinkedIn. I'll also be in the Discord after this for a little while in the channel for this track. So yeah, get in contact with me or one of my colleagues anytime. We're happy to answer any questions you might have.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Falko. That was a super interesting talk even. We've got a few questions in the chat if you're happy to stick around.
Sure, of course.
So we've got, from the publishing models that you presented, is there a specific developer profile that fits each model, or can developers try both?
No, you can generally try both. And what we often have is leading from one to the other, especially when we just started this. early in the year, we started with studios that we already tested like games with before. So that always helps to establish a relationship, get in touch with the right people at the publisher, and then you can move from there. And publishers will be more likely have a better feeling in kind of giving you these initial, for us, at least 3 months of trust in advance to kind of start a cooperation like this. However, if you're already well established in the industry, you launched a bunch of well-performing or even hit games, then a publisher should be open to work with you in that kind of way from the beginning. For work for hire, it's similar. If you have kind of like a bit of a history of finishing these games, you should be able to get these kind of deals. I think that's a bit more challenging if you want to start like with your first project being work for hire in the games industry.
Okay. On your new publishing model, what are the your basic requirements when choosing the developers that you work with?
So we're pretty open. We'd like to see some previous experience in the hyper-casual space. It doesn't have to be like huge hits that were published with the biggest publisher, but some interest to show us that you've been thinking about this model, you know how to make a hyper-casual game. And other than that, we're really open. We know that it can take a very small team of 2 to 3 people to make great games. Doesn't really matter to us where the team is based. So yeah, we're happy to talk to everyone and see if it's a good fit. Okay.
Another question in chat. Do you tend to see a positive ROI in India and other tier 3 geos?
It's not a huge focus for us. So with most of our games, we're focusing on tier 1 first, and then expand from there. It's always something that we add, and it can be ROI positive, but it's generally not a launch market for us. Though there are some markets that are more important for us, being partially based in Asia, for example, than there would be for a typical publisher. I mean, China is, I think, the example for most underrated market for a lot of Western publishers that kind of claim they're global, but China is a bit too difficult in the end, and they don't really do it. Some of the top ones do it, but not a lot of the mid-range ones don't. For us, China is the second biggest market. For some games, even a little bit bigger than the US, especially for iOS. For iOS, these markets are neck to neck and are very harshly competing. So it depends on the market. There are some Southeast Asian markets that are also doing pretty well for us, but we definitely start with tier 1 and then work our way from there.
Okay, awesome. Another question here. What are your thoughts on new ad monetization approaches like non-intrusive / in-game ads, rewarded surveys, and audio ads?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. I didn't see too much data on it. I'm overall a big fan of rewarded video whenever it's possible. But then in hyper-casual, you have like very limited time with a player because the retention is just so low, right? So I'd love to see some innovation around that. And we've seen anything from more aggressive interstitials, right? With games that are extremely marketable but have very low retention. But also in the other way, we saw these hybrid casual games that rather than like putting on more and more interstitials, keep like from the gameplay side, more ideas to keep players longer in the game, and then suddenly some mechanics like in-app purchases or more integrated rewarded ads become way more popular. And we see a lot of kind of like experiments with ads right now. A lot of things that you saw in mid-core, kind of like special offers, early offers, and these kind of things in an then ad kind of environment, right? Rather than selling you a starter kit for a certain amount, you start seeing like a starter kit that you can get for a certain amount of rewarded ad views. And rewarded ad views are always better than just interstitials. So if it fits well, it doesn't annoy the players too much because you always have the offset of seeing lower retention when you go too aggressive on the ads. Whenever you can balance that, the player satisfaction with an ad that is like valuable to you, that's the perfect way.
Okay, perfect. What is the expected development time in this new model, and what happens if the development team blows the deadlines?
So It depends a bit. Blowing deadlines in hyper-casual is usually not as bad as like in a mid-core game when we suddenly talk a couple months delayed. The studios that we work with now have usually a 2-week cycle for a prototype. And it's like 1 to a couple of developers working on one project. For us, we set it up that we pay by delivered prototype, so we don't really mind that much if something takes 3 more days and is then much better. The developer should see that within the time they can deliver something that is worth the value that was negotiated at the beginning, I'd say. But we're giving the developer like a lot of leeway on that.
Okay. What are the most important factors we should try and optimize to get the best possible results on a CTR test? What should we be focusing on?
Yeah, that's hard to say. I think the game is the most important thing. I mean, yes, you don't have people really playing the game at that stage, but like there's just something to a few games, right? Something that makes you want to play it. And that can be a setting that you immediately relate to. There can be a gameplay that looks fascinating, or it can be kind of like a physics simulation that just looks fun to mess around with, and that's what people want to do, and that's how you generate CTRs. There is some magic in between. I'm not a UA manager, but there is some stuff when it comes to background colors, what you present, how fast you present different things. If you present failing scenarios or winning scenarios, and especially in playables, that's very important. For certain games, it's good to see somebody fail and thinking, I want to do that better. And for some games, it's the other way around. So it depends a little bit on your individual game, but I think the quality of the game is key.
Okay. Is there an advantage for publishers if they are focusing on a unique geo?
There's an advantage in that market. I'm not sure if there's an advantage in general. You should always kind of like balance that out. I think it's good for a publisher to establish themselves. I mean, for us, that was the unique selling point for quite a while, right? That we provide service in China that rivals the other Chinese publishers, but also have this Western kind of more approachable, open, communicative, transparent setup that Chinese publishers were lacking. And the advantage in the Chinese market allowed us to grow into a position where we can serve the global market correctly. But in the end, if a developer comes to you, they expect that you can handle every tier 1 and tier 2 country just as good as the biggest players in the market. So if you want high quality games from the best developers, you have to do all these markets well.
Okay, so with this new model, are you only working that in Chinese markets, or is that working worldwide now?
That is working worldwide. So we have studios from around the world. We have studios in Denmark where we are based that we cooperate with. We have a studio from the Ukraine that we're working with right now. So it's open to everybody, yeah.
Okay, perfect. And the last question we've got here, in licensing agreements or the new model, what sort of metrics benchmark are you looking at?
So I had the list before. Again, it depends a bit on the publisher. For us, we usually say like 40% day 1 retention, a playtime that is 15 better 18 minutes, a CPI of 50 cents or lower. And one thing that we look at a bit more than other publishers maybe is the impression to install ratio, because it gives you a good feeling of the overall size of the market and like the market for your specific game, not in general. And it kind of balances out click-through and conversion rate, which can be different between a few of the ad networks. And there we usually look at 3 to 4%. But again, it depends on the game. So if something is really lacking on one side but overperforms on the other, that kind of balances it out.
Okay, perfect. We just have one more question pop in right at the end there. Do you use GIF or HTML5 in UA?
I'm not 100% sure. I don't think we use GIFs. So we use videos with sound and everything. A lot of like a lot of in-app stuff as well through the Facebook audience network. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I can check that with our UA managers.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'll wrap that one on there. Thank you so much for joining us, Falko, and great talk. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the event.
Will do. Thanks. See ya.
Perfect.